Number 10. Bourbon Street, New Orleans, Louisiana. For over a century, Bourbon Street has been shorthand for one thing: a good time you couldn't get anywhere else. Jazz spilling out of open doorways, hurricanes in plastic cups, a French Quarter energy that felt lawless in the fun way. It built its reputation as the place where Mardi Gras never really ended, where the party started before you arrived and kept going long after you left. That reputation was earned, honestly. Through most of the 20th century, Bourbon Street anchored New Orleans tourism, drawing visitors who wanted live music, historic architecture, and a nightlife scene unlike anywhere else in the country. Local business owners built entire livelihoods on the promise that the street sold itself, no marketing needed beyond word of mouth and a century of postcards. But public records and local reporting over the past 2 decades tell a more complicated story. Visitor surveys increasingly cite overcrowding, aggressive street hustling, and a rise in violent incidents as reasons for cutting trips short or avoiding the area after dark. Sanitation complaints, trash, spilled drinks, the smell that clings to the pavement by mid-morning show up again and again in traveler reviews. Bar and restaurant turnover on the Strip has climbed as rents rise and margins shrink, with long-time establishments giving way to short-lived novelty bars, chasing quick tourist dollars before moving on. Walk it today, and the contrast is immediate. The music is still there, but so is the press of shoulder-to-shoulder crowds, the price-gouged drinks, the barkers working every doorway with a practiced urgency. Longtime residents describe a street that used to feel like a party you were invited to, and now feels like one you're being sold, ticket by ticket, drink by overpriced drink. The turning point, many locals argue, wasn't one incident. It was the slow accumulation of them, each one chipping away at a reputation built over 100 years. City efforts to add lighting, barricades, and increased patrols have helped in stretches, but the perception shift has been harder to undo than the infrastructure. And this one's downfall, at least, came with music playing the whole way down.
Number 9. Times Square, New York City, New York. Times Square was never subtle. Since the early 1900s, it's been the beating, blinking heart of American spectacle. Broadway marquees, ball drops, the place where the city that never sleeps put its energy on full display. For generations, standing under those lights felt like standing at the center of the world. That reputation was built on genuine cultural weight. Theater, media headquarters, and a concentration of iconic architecture made Times Square a legitimate landmark long before it became a punchline. Tourists came for Broadway. They stayed for the sensory overload. But local reporting and visitor surveys over the past 15 years point to a steady dilution of that experience. Costumed characters aggressively soliciting photos and tips, counterfeit merchandise vendors and ticket scalpers have drawn repeated complaints and periodic city crackdowns. Pricing at nearby restaurants and attractions is consistently flagged in traveler reviews as inflated well beyond comparable Manhattan neighborhoods, with little corresponding improvement in quality. Public records show ongoing enforcement actions against unlicensed vendors, a sign the problem never fully resolves. It just cycles. Atmospherically, the square has become less a destination and more a gauntlet. Elbow-to-elbow crowds moving at a crawl, giant screens selling you something every few seconds. Longtime New Yorkers largely avoid it entirely, ceding the space to first-time visitors who don't yet know to. The tipping point wasn't a single scandal, but a gradual redefinition. Times Square stopped being where New York showed off. It became where New York cashed in. Pedestrian plazas added in the 2010s helped with congestion, but didn't touch the deeper issue, a landmark that increasingly exists to extract money from the people visiting it. It's still lit up every night, still packed shoulder to shoulder, but ask a local the last time they went voluntarily, and the silence tells you what the reviews already say. And the next spot didn't fall from commercialization, it fell from its own party. Number 8. Dirty Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Myrtle Beach earned its nickname the old-fashioned way by throwing a party that never really stopped. For decades, it was the go-to spring break and family vacation strip on the East Coast.
Wide beaches, boardwalk arcades, and a reputation for letting loose that pulled in millions of visitors a year. That reputation was the whole appeal. Affordable hotels, mini golf on every corner, and a permissive nightlife scene made Myrtle Beach the accessible alternative to pricier coastal destinations, especially for families and college crowds looking for a good time without a steep price tag. But that same permissiveness, local reporting suggests, is what eventually curdled the brand. Crime statistics for the greater Myrtle Beach area have drawn scrutiny for years, with certain stretches of the boardwalk repeatedly flagged in visitor surveys for safety concerns, particularly at night. Water quality advisories tied to runoff have periodically closed sections of beach, undercutting the core appeal of a beach town. Business turnover along the boardwalk has been steady, with novelty shops and short-term rentals replacing longer-standing family businesses. The atmosphere reflects the split reputation, family-friendly by day, chaotic by night, with visitor reviews increasingly warning newcomers to pick their hotel block carefully. Longtime vacationers, who grew up going every summer, describe a strip that's louder, pricier, and less predictable than the one they remember, the charm replaced by a sense that anything could happen, and not always the good kind. The turning point tracks with the Strip's own growth. As Myrtle Beach expanded and marketed itself harder to spring break crowds, it inherited spring break's problems without shedding its family destination branding, leaving both audiences a little disappointed. It's still one of the most visited beach towns in the country, but come let loose and come safely have become harder promises to keep at the same time. And the next spot's decline wasn't about danger, it was about a name that stopped meaning anything.
Number 7. Hollywood Walk of Fame, Los Angeles, California. Few landmarks promise as much as the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a star embedded in the sidewalk, your name next to legends. For over 60 years, walking that stretch of Hollywood Boulevard felt like walking through the history of American entertainment itself. The Walk of Fame earned its mythology honestly. Since 1960, it's honored genuine icons of film, television, music, and radio, and for decades, the surrounding boulevard reflected that same glamour, with premieres, historic theaters, and crowds drawn purely by star power. But visitor surveys and local reporting increasingly describe a boulevard that's drifted from its own legacy. Costumed characters, often unlicensed reproductions of copyrighted characters, aggressively solicit tips for photos, a practice that's drawn repeated police intervention and public complaints. Souvenir shops selling low-quality merchandise have replaced many of the boulevard's historic businesses. Public records show the sidewalk itself has required repeated, costly restoration due to grime, gum, and general wear from foot traffic that outpaces maintenance budgets. The result is an atmosphere increasingly disconnected from its own premise. Tourists searching the pavement for a star's name while stepping around litter, aggressive vendors, and characters posing for tips just steps away. Atmosphere that visitor reviews frequently describe as underwhelming compared to expectations. Longtime Angelenos tend to treat the boulevard as something you take out-of-town guests to see once, not somewhere you'd choose to spend an afternoon. The turning point arguably came as rents rose and legitimate entertainment businesses moved elsewhere in the city, leaving the boulevard's economy increasingly dependent on tourist volume rather than industry presence, a shift that changed who the street was really built for. It's still one of the most photographed sidewalks in the world, but somewhere between the stars and the sidewalk grime, the magic got harder to find. And the next spot didn't lose its shine to knockoffs, it lost it to the price tag.
Number 6. Fisherman's Wharf, San Francisco, California. Fisherman's Wharf built its name on something simple and real: working boats, fresh catch, and a genuine slice of San Francisco's maritime history. For much of the 20th century, it was where locals and visitors alike came for honest seafood and a view of the bay that hadn't yet been packaged for tourists. That authenticity was the foundation of its appeal.
crab stands run by actual fishing families, historic piers, and sea lions that colonized Pier 39 on their own gave the wharf a reputation as one of the few tourist areas that felt unscripted. But local reporting and visitor surveys over the past 2 decades increasingly describe a waterfront that's traded that authenticity for turnover. Pricing at wharf restaurants is a recurring complaint in traveler reviews, with menu costs frequently cited as disproportionate to quality or portion size. Public records show declining numbers of working fishing operations at the wharf, with many storefronts shifting toward chain retail and standardized tourist fare. Business closures among longtime family-run stands have been steady, replaced with operations with less connection to the area's fishing history. Atmospherically, the wharf now reads as manufactured in places where it once felt genuine. Souvenir shops repeating the same inventory block after block, crowds funneled through narrow walkways, street performers competing for the same tight blocks of tourist attention. Longtime San Franciscans describe a wharf that increasingly caters exclusively to first-time visitors, with little reason for locals to return once they've seen it. The turning point tracks with the broader decline of the local fishing industry itself. As fewer boats went out, fewer businesses depended on the actual harbor, and more depended entirely on tourist spending, changing the wharf's economic center of gravity permanently. The sea lions are still there, still free. Increasingly, they're also the most honest thing left on the pier. And the next spot didn't fade from overpricing, it just stopped opening at all. Number 5, Lake Dolores Water Park, Mojave Desert, California. Lake Dolores promised something almost absurd, a water park in the middle of the desert. For families driving between Los Angeles and Las Vegas in the 1980s and 90s, that novelty alone made it a beloved roadside stop. Water slides and a reservoir carved improbably out of dry, cracked earth. Its appeal was built on that contrast. Lake Dolores, later rebranded as Discovery Water Park, drew steady road trip traffic for years, offering relief from the desert heat and a genuinely memorable detour for families making the long drive. But public records and local reporting show a park that struggled repeatedly with the same problems: water and infrastructure costs in a desert environment, along with safety violations that led to multiple closures throughout the 1990s and 2000s. A brief reopening attempt in the mid-2000s ultimately failed under the same financial pressures. The park has sat closed and deteriorating for well over a decade, with visitor accounts and urban exploration reports describing rusted slides, drained pools, and collapsing structures baking in the desert sun. The atmosphere today is less water park than monument to a water park. Faded paint, skeletal slide frames, and reservoir beds long since dried out, visited now mostly by photographers and explorers drawn to abandoned places rather than families looking for relief from the heat. Longtime desert highway travelers who remember stopping there as kids describe driving past it now as genuinely unsettling, a landmark of their childhood reduced to rubble along the same route. The turning point was less a single event than an unsustainable premise. A water-intensive attraction in one of the driest climates in the country was probably always running against the odds, and repeated ownership changes never solved the underlying math. It never quite recovered from its own ambition. And the next spot's downfall didn't come from the desert. It came from its own hotel strip pricing itself into a corner.
Number 4, Waikiki Hotel Strip, Honolulu, Hawaii. Waikiki has been the postcard image of Hawaiian vacationing for the better part of a century. A crescent of beach lined with resort towers, framed by Diamond Head, sold to generations of Americans as paradise itself. That reputation didn't come from nothing. Waikiki's development through the mid-20th century turned it into the epicenter of Hawaiian tourism, with genuine natural beauty and world-class beach access anchoring its appeal even as the skyline grew increasingly dense with hotels. But visitor surveys and local reporting increasingly describe a strip strained by its own success. Beach erosion, worsened by the density of shoreline development, has required repeated and costly sand replenishment projects, with public records showing ongoing efforts just to maintain the beach visitors come for. Hotel and dining prices along the Strip are consistently cited in traveler reviews as among the steepest in the country, often disproportionate to aging infrastructure at older properties. Overcrowding on the beach itself is a recurring complaint, with visitor density in peak season leaving little of the spacious paradise feel the marketing still promises. The atmosphere reflects a place stretched thin, towers packed close together, beach real estate at a premium, vendors and timeshare pitches working the sidewalks between hotels. Native Hawaiian and longtime local perspectives, increasingly represented in local reporting, describe a Strip that has commercialized the image of Hawaii while displacing much of what made the culture and environment sustainable in the first place. The turning point tracks with decades of continuous high-density development outpacing the natural resources, namely the beach, that the entire Strip depends on, a tension public officials have acknowledged but not resolved. Waikiki is still stunning in photographs. On the ground, increasingly, it's stunning and strained in equal measure. And the next spot fell not from crowding, but from decades of neglect.
Number 3. Lake Shawnee Amusement Park, Mercer County, West Virginia. Lake Shawnee operated for barely over a decade, from the late 1920s through the 1960s, but for the families in that stretch of West Virginia, it was a genuine hometown attraction. Rides, a swimming lake, a place to spend a summer afternoon in an area without many comparable options. Its appeal, while regional rather than national, was real. Local reporting from the era describes steady attendance and community affection for the park during its operating years, a modest but meaningful piece of small-town Americana. But a series of accidents and fatalities on the property, documented in local historical records, contributed to the park's closure, and it has sat abandoned for decades since. Rusted ride frames, a drained pool, and overgrown pathways remain on the site, which has become better known today for ghost tours and paranormal-themed visits than for anything resembling its original purpose. Public records show the property has changed hands multiple times, with periodic proposals for restoration or redevelopment that have consistently stalled. The atmosphere today is defined entirely by decay. Skeletal Ferris wheel frames rusting into the tree line, cracked concrete where a pool once stood, silence where a summer crowd used to be. Visitor accounts of present-day tours describe a site that feels frozen mid-collapse rather than reclaimed by nature, a small park that never got the chance to fade gracefully. The turning point was unambiguous. The accidents that led to closure were the beginning of the end, and every year since has been the site settling further into disrepair rather than any path toward revival. What's left isn't really a vacation spot anymore. It's a reminder of one, sitting quietly in the woods. And the next spot's downfall came from crowds that never left, not a closure that never came back.
Number 2. Venice Beach Boardwalk, Los Angeles, California. Venice Beach Boardwalk built its reputation as the wildest, most unfiltered stretch of the California coast. Bodybuilders on Muscle Beach, street performers, artists, and a boardwalk economy that felt like nowhere else in the country. For decades, that unpredictability was the draw. That reputation was earned through genuine countercultural history. Venice's boardwalk became a symbol of California free expression from the mid-20th century onward, drawing visitors specifically for its unscripted, anything-goes energy. But local reporting and visitor surveys over the past 2 decades increasingly describe that same unpredictability tipping into something harder to enjoy. Homelessness and associated public safety concerns along the boardwalk have been a persistent subject of local news coverage and city policy debate. Aggressive vending and panhandling are frequently cited in traveler reviews as detracting from the experience, alongside periodic reports of theft and altercations. Public records show repeated city cleanup and enforcement initiatives over the years, with mixed and often temporary results. The atmosphere now sits in tension with the marketing, a boardwalk still full of genuine artists and performers, but increasingly framed by encampments, aggressive sales pitches, and a level of visible disorder that visitor reviews flag as unexpected for a major tourist destination. Longtime Venice residents describe watching the balance shift over the years, from eccentric but charming to something that feels, more often now, unmanaged. The turning point tracks with broader regional trends in housing and public safety policy, playing out visibly on one of the city's most photographed stretches of sand, a boardwalk that became a symbol of a much larger, unresolved issue. Venice Beach is still one of the most iconic strips in America. It's also become a case study in what happens when a city's unresolved problems wash up on its most visited beach. And at number 1, the disappointment isn't about crowding or crime, it's about a boulder that was never going to live up to the hype.
Number 1. Plymouth Rock, Plymouth, Massachusetts. Plymouth Rock occupies a strange place in American mythology, a single boulder tied to the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620, elevated over centuries into one of the most symbolically loaded objects in the country's founding story. That symbolism is genuine, even if the historical record around the rock itself is thin. Plymouth Rock has been commemorated and protected since the 18th century, and its association with the Mayflower's landing gave it outsized cultural weight relative to its physical presence. And that gap is precisely the problem. Visitor surveys and traveler reviews consistently, almost universally, describe the actual experience as underwhelming. A modest, fenced-off boulder, smaller than most visitors expect, viewed from behind a railing in a small waterfront portico. Unlike every other spot on this list, Plymouth Rock's decline isn't about crowding, crime, or cost. It's about a landmark that was, by most honest accounts, never going to match the scale of the story built around it. The atmosphere reflects that mismatch directly, a quiet, well-maintained historic site that draws steady tourist traffic, met almost immediately by visible visitor disappointment, with "smaller than I thought" ranking among the single most common phrases in public reviews of the site. Local guides and historians have long acknowledged this gap openly, treating it as part of the visit rather than something to disguise. There's no scandal here, no turning point, no single incident to point to. The rock has sat in roughly the same spot for centuries. What changed was the expectation gap widening as the story around it grew larger with each retelling, while the object itself stayed exactly the same size it always was. Plymouth Rock never claimed to be anything more than what it is. Maybe that's the real lesson at the end of this list. Sometimes the downfall isn't decline at all. Sometimes it's just a reputation that outgrew the reality from the very beginning.